The first time Caleb Mercer saw her, she was standing alone beneath the wooden awning of the old clinic, dressed in black that swallowed the desert sun whole, the wind tugging at her veil like it wanted to steal her grief and scatter it across the plains. But grief in Red Hollow wasn't something the wind could carry away. It settled deep in the bones, and folks said the widow of Dr. Elias Whitmore carried more of it than the whole town combined. Caleb had ridden in half-dead from a bullet wound and fever, but even through the haze he could see she was the kind of woman who'd stitched up more than torn flesh. She'd stitched up broken men, and God help him, he was the most broken of them all. Red Hollow, perched between dust-bitten hills and a river that ran thin most summers, had once been proud to boast the finest physician west of the Mississippi, Dr. Elias Whitmore, a man who'd delivered babies, set bones, and once even pulled a rancher back from the edge of death after a rattler bite. But when the fever took him last winter, it left behind more than an empty clinic. It left behind his wife, Margaret Whitmore, a woman folks whispered about in low voices, not because she was scandalous, but because she refused to leave, refused to fold under sorrow. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and kept the clinic doors open, as if grief were just another wound, needing careful tending. Caleb hadn't meant to ride into Red Hollow. Truth be told, he'd meant to die somewhere quiet, where no one would bother asking questions. The bullet lodged beneath his ribs was meant as a warning from men he once called brothers, and the fever that followed was meant to finish the job. But a half-starved horse and a stubborn will dragged him to the one place he'd sworn never to return. Because Red Hollow wasn't just a town, it was where his father had been buried after a range war that split families like kindling, and Caleb had ridden away, swearing he'd never look back. Yet here he was, sliding from the saddle and collapsing in the dust outside the widow's clinic. Margaret didn't flinch when she saw the blood soaking through his shirt, didn't gasp or cry out for help. She simply knelt beside him, her hands steady as a church bell on Sunday, and when she rolled him onto his back, their eyes met for the briefest moment. His were clouded with pain and regret, hers were sharp and searching, as if she were measuring not just the wound, but the man beneath it. "You're not dying on my doorstep," she said, voice calm but edged with command. And in that instant Caleb understood that death might be riding close behind him, but it would have to get past her first. Inside the clinic, the air smelled of antiseptic and dried sage. The wooden floors creaked like old memories under Margaret's boots as she worked, cutting away Caleb's shirt and revealing the angry red flesh around the bullet wound. She moved with practiced precision, cleaning, probing, ignoring his groans, and when he finally blacked out from the pain, she kept going, because she'd learned long ago that hesitation cost lives, and she had buried one husband already. She would not bury another soul if her skill could prevent it, even if that soul belonged to a stranger with scars that spoke of violence and choices gone wrong. When Caleb woke hours later, the world was quieter. The fever still burned, but the sharp agony had dulled to a heavy ache. He found himself in a narrow bed near the clinic window, the curtains stirring in the evening breeze, and Margaret sat beside him reading from a small leather-bound journal. She looked up when he stirred, not with warmth but with assessment. "Bullets out," she said plainly. "You lost a fair amount of blood, and you'll stay put till I say otherwise." Caleb tried to argue, pride rising like bile, but the look she gave him was enough to silence a gunslinger mid-draw. It didn't take long for the town to notice the stranger in the widow's care. Red Hollow thrived on rumor the way cattle thrived on grass, and by sundown folks had already decided Caleb Mercer was either a wanted outlaw or a tragic hero, depending on who was doing the talking. Sheriff Tom Callahan paid a visit, hat in hand but suspicion in his eyes. He lingered at the foot of Caleb's bed and studied the man's face like he was searching for a name on a wanted poster. Margaret stood between them, not protective exactly, but firm, reminding the sheriff that any man under her roof was her patient first, and any questions could wait until he was strong enough to answer them that night. As the lantern light flickered against the walls and the town settled into uneasy sleep, Caleb lay awake, listening to Margaret move about the clinic. He heard the soft scrape of chair legs, the clink of glass bottles, the steady rhythm of a woman who refused to crumble under loneliness, and for the first time in years he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not just gratitude, not just relief, but a fragile thread of hope he hadn't earned, because he knew the truth she did not. The men who shot him would not stop at a warning. They would come looking to finish what they started, and when they did, the widow who saved him would stand directly in their path. Whether she knew it or not, by the third morning the fever had loosened its grip on Caleb Mercer, though it still clung to him like desert heat at high noon. Margaret Whitmore changed his bandages with the same quiet resolve she'd shown the day he collapsed at her door. Her hands steady, her eyes watchful, and Caleb found himself studying her when she thought he slept, noticing how grief had not hardened her but carved her into something stronger. Like canyon stone shaped by relentless wind, he told himself he would leave as soon as he could stand, because the longer he stayed the closer danger crept, and he had no right dragging trouble to the doorstep of the woman who'd pulled him back from the edge of the grave. Margaret knew he was hiding something. She had seen too many men in pain not to recognize the look of unfinished business in his eyes. The wound in his side was healing, but the wound in his spirit bled freely. And when she finally asked who had shot him, he gave her a half-truth about a poker game gone wrong. The lie hung between them thick as smoke. She didn't press him, not yet, but she had lived long enough beside Dr. Elias Whitmore to know when a man carried more than one bullet inside him, and she suspected Caleb's deadliest wound was the one he refused to name. Sheriff Tom Callahan returned that afternoon with news that set the town buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. 3 riders had been spotted crossing the southern ridge, hard men with dusters and rifles, asking quiet questions in the last settlement they passed. The description was enough to drain the color from Caleb's face. He tried to sit up too quickly, and pain lanced through his side. Margaret pressed him back down with surprising strength, her gaze sharp now, demanding answers without words. And in that moment, Caleb realized the storm he had ridden away from had finally caught his scent. They won't stop, Caleb admitted at last, his voice rough as gravel. He spoke of a cattle outfit turned outlaw crew, men who rustled herds under moonlight and shot anyone who stood in their path. He had once ridden with them, young and angry and hungry for something that felt like belonging, until he'd refused an order that would have left a rancher's family dead in the ashes of their own home. That refusal had earned him a bullet and a death sentence signed by the very men he once called brothers. Margaret listened without interruption, the lines around her eyes deepening, not with fear but with calculation. Red Hollow had seen its share of trouble, but it had also seen Margaret Whitmore stand firm through the worst winter fever in memory. And when whispers spread that armed riders were nearing town, folks looked not to the sheriff first, but to the widow in black. She moved through the streets that evening gathering supplies, speaking calm words to anxious shopkeepers, reminding them to secure doors and keep lanterns low. There was no panic in her stride, only resolve, and Caleb watched from the clinic window with a mix of awe and dread, because the men hunting him did not scare easy, and they did not forgive you should leave. Caleb told her once they were alone again, the clinic lit by lamplight and shadow. Take what you can and ride north to your sister's place. I'll draw them away. Margaret met his gaze without flinching, the black fabric of her dress whispering as she stepped closer. This is my town, she said quietly. My husband is buried here. My work is here, and I will not abandon it because violent men think they own the night. Her words struck him harder than any fist, because he had spent years running from ghosts while she had chosen to stand and face hers. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint thunder of hooves. The sound rolled across the plains like distant gunfire, and every soul in Red Hollow felt it in their bones. Sheriff Callahan gathered a handful of ranch hands near the saloon, rifles loaded but hands unsteady. They were farmers and fathers more than fighters, and Caleb knew if it came to bloodshed the town would suffer first. He swung his legs over the side of the bed despite the protest of his wound, each movement a reminder that he was not yet whole. But some debts could not wait for healing. Margaret tried to stop him, anger flashing through her composure for the first time since he'd arrived, but Caleb caught her hand gently, his grip warm and firm. You saved my life, he said, voice low. Now, let me try to make it worth something. Their eyes held in the flickering lantern glow, something unspoken passing between them, not love born of comfort, but something forged in shared defiance. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, 3 riders cresting the hill under a bleeding sunset, and as Red Hollow held its breath, Caleb Mercer stepped out of the widow's clinic to face the men who had come to finish him. Knowing that this time he was not riding alone, the 3 riders came down the main stretch of Red Hollow like they owned every plank and nail in it, dust curling behind their horses, rifles resting easy in their hands. At their center rode Wade Cutter, broad-shouldered and cold-eyed, a man Caleb Mercer once trusted with his back in a gunfight. The sight of him tightened something deep in Caleb's chest. Not fear exactly, but the bitter taste of old mistakes come home to roost. Lantern light spilled from the saloon and the clinic windows, casting long shadows across the street, and in one of those windows stood Margaret Whitmore, straight as a fence post, watching the storm gather without stepping back. "Evening, Mercer," Wade called out, his voice carrying smooth and deadly through the hush. "Heard you crawled off to lick your wounds." Caleb stood in the center of the street despite the fire in his side, boots planted firm in the dirt. He felt every heartbeat like a drum of war. "Wasn't planning on seeing you again," he answered, keeping his tone steady, though he knew the town listened from behind shutters and doors. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Red Hollow, about the widow who had chosen to save him instead of letting him die. Quietly, in the dust, Wade's gaze flicked toward the clinic, toward the silhouette in black framed by lamplight, and a slow grin spread across his face, the kind that promised ruin. "Pretty little town you dragged us to," he said. "Be a shame if it burned because of you." That was when Caleb understood the true weight of his past. It wasn't just his life on the line. It was every innocent soul within earshot. The ranchers gripping rifles near the saloon, Sheriff Callahan standing stiff beside them, and Margaret inside that clinic, who had buried one good man already and would not bury another without a fight. The first shot cracked through the evening like thunder splitting the sky. It wasn't clear who fired first, only that the air filled with smoke and shouting. Caleb moved on instinct born from years of hard riding and harder living. He dove behind a water trough as bullets splintered wood around him. Pain flared in his side, but he pushed through it, returning fire with deliberate aim. One of Wade's men tumbled from his saddle. The town erupted into chaos. Horses reared, windows shattered, and above it all, Caleb's only thought was to keep the gunfire away from the clinic door. Inside the clinic, Margaret did not cower. She moved with purpose, ushering a frightened stable boy under a heavy oak table, loading her late husband's old revolver with hands that had delivered babies and stitched torn flesh. Grief had taught her that love was not fragile, it was fierce. And when the door burst open and one of Wade's men staggered in wounded and wild-eyed, she did not hesitate. She leveled the gun and ordered him to drop his rifle. Her voice steady as Judgment Day. The outlaw faltered, shocked perhaps that the widow in black was not merely a healer but a guardian of her own ground. Outside, Caleb locked eyes with Wade through the haze of gunsmoke. The two men circled one another in the dirt street that had seen too much blood already. "You could have stayed loyal," Wade growled. "Could have had a share of everything." Caleb spat dust and regret. "Not at the cost you were asking." The final exchange came swift and brutal. 2 shots almost as one, but only one man remained standing when the echo faded into the hills. Wade Cutter fell hard into the dirt he once claimed to rule, and with him fell the last chain binding Caleb to a life of lawless shadow. Silence crept back over Red Hollow as the surviving outlaw fled into the dark. Wounded and riderless horses scattered, and townsfolk slowly emerged from hiding. Sheriff Callahan lowered his rifle with a long breath. Ranch hands checked the injured, and Caleb stood swaying in the center of it all, blood seeping once more through the bandage at his side. Margaret rushed to him without thought for who might see, catching him before his knees gave out. The street that had moments before echoed with violence now held only the quiet murmur of relief and the soft rustle of her black dress in the settling dust. Dawn broke gentle and gold over Red Hollow, lighting the clinic windows with promise instead of fear. Caleb lay once more in the narrow bed by the window, alive because a widow had refused to let death claim him. Margaret sat beside him, exhaustion lining her face, but something else there too. Not just duty, not just gratitude, but the fragile beginning of something neither of them dared name yet. Outside the town repaired broken boards and patched bullet holes, life pressing forward as it always did. And when Caleb finally met her gaze in the quiet morning light, he understood that sometimes the one who needs saving most is not the man bleeding in the street, but the woman who chooses to believe he can become better than the life he rode in with. And in that understanding a new chapter began, not written in gunfire or grief, but in the steady, stubborn hope of 2 souls who had survived the night and decided to stay.